Helen. Thank you for meeting me today. You're going to be my first person on the podcast, the Cauldron of Curiosities. And one of the first things I thought it might be helpful to anyone who's listening is, what is curiosity? What is curiosity to you?
I think a curiosity is a state of not knowing and of knowing that we don't know. Whereas the opposite of curiosity is where we think we know and we feel kind of certain that we know something. So I think if I was to kind of sum it up, that's what I would say.
Yeah, because I always find I term myself a curious explorer because I love going off down rabbit holes. So I'll be, oh, what does that mean? Or where does that go? What's over the wall? The essence of a cat, of being nosy enough. There's a nosiness to it, isn't there? Curiosity is like wanting to know, why does it do that? Or why do people do that? Or why do the clouds create that shape? And it's also links back to that joy of when you're a child and you could, oh, if I do that, what will happen? Especially if none of your parents were watching to tell you not to do it. I'm sure
Yeah.
you've experienced that.
Well, it's almost, I think also about the word experimental. So to be truly experimental, like if you think about a scientist doing an experiment, they might have a hypothesis or a theory, but they hopefully they're not too set on that because they want to be genuinely curious about whether their hypothesis is right or not. So they have to be open to the idea that they could be wrong.
Yes.
So I often do that because I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist and an acceptance and commitment therapist, and we do something called a behavioral experiment, which basically means like, so if you have a hypothesis that if I speak in a meeting, people, it will be embarrassing and people will shame me or something like that, and that prevents you from speaking in a meeting, then be truly curious of what might happen. Let's try speaking and see what actually happens. And so you're genuinely curious. Like maybe you will get shouted down. I mean, we don't know. Maybe your
Mm.
hypothesis is right. Um, Rather than that kind of feel the fear, do it anyway, which is just like you need to push through and it'll be fine. Almost like what can think of as toxic positivity, where it's kind of like everything's going to be fine. There's nothing to worry about. Push through. Whereas in a behavioral experiment, you're genuinely curious. So I was brought up to be a good girl, and
Yeah.
I've genuinely followed that. But now that I've left the NHS, I don't feel the need to kind of conform as much. So I'm trying out kind of like bits of naughtiness. Um, so it's so much fun. So I bought myself a little scooter that looks like a child's scooter, but bigger. And people use it for commuting from, from the train station to work and things. Um, and so I'm kind of like, where can I take this scooter? Because people frown upon scooters because because they're new and people don't really understand why they're there and what they're doing and they look a bit dangerous. So people are a bit against scooters. But then when they see that it's a middle-aged woman and it doesn't have an engine, they're a bit curious as to what is it actually. So I've just tried scooting around places that you're not really meant to. So my most interesting one was the Theatre Royal in Norwich, has got two entrances opposite each other. And so I just scooted through the middle of that. So I went through the reception area on my scooter and back out the other side just to kind of see what happened, just to be curious.
And what happened?
Nothing. I mean, that's the thing that's most interesting is that like often when I work with people who are frightened of panicking and fainting in public, um, the sad thing is that actually most people don't really care about other people. They're mostly just getting on with their lives and they're not really that interested in you. And maybe that's a bit sad and maybe it's not, but actually
Yeah.
you aren't really the center of things, perhaps in the way that your brain tells you you are.
Very well, Don Miguel Ruiz talks about that, doesn't he, in the Four Agreements, about how our perception of what people are thinking or seeing is completely different. And he uses an analogy of going into a movie house, and the first movie is your life as a situation that you're watching, and you're going, yeah, I recognize that. And you go into movie number two, it's the same situation, your mother's sat there watching it, but you're watching it and you think, no, that isn't how it was. it was how it was in movie theatre number 1. And he says, we have to realise that we all view things differently, and it's getting ourselves out of that headspace of thinking, A, that the person's thinking about us, because they're probably not. And that's really difficult, because we often think, don't we? We go somewhere and we assume that what we're doing is of great interest to those around us. Now, I always do add this precursor. If I'm in the room, I will be looking at you because I'm curious.
Yeah.
I want to know what you're doing, and why did you choose that particular colour, and where did you buy your boots from? Where did you buy your bag from? Because I like that. What's, is it real leather? All of those sort of questions are running through my head. And years ago, I'd never ask anyone. Whereas now I will ask, I'll say, where did you buy that from? Or where did you get your hair done? It looks lovely. And it's amazing the interaction you get from people when you are respectfully interacting about what you're curious about.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I definitely have that idea, like in the street. Like, so some people I mean, I live in it's like the place that it tends to be a lot of public sector workers, so they can't really, so they're a bit sort of aspiring middle class, but they can't really afford the posh area. So
Mm.
our street is kind of a real mixture of different people, and I just say hello to everyone and just kind of be curious. And I think sometimes there's this idea that, like, basically if you don't know them, they're the enemy, so you have to kind of keep them at a distance. And there is a I mean, I guess alongside curiosity, we have boundaries. So, if someone asks you a question, you can say that's none of your business, and the other person could say that. So a lot of people were, and so I came out as lesbian in the 90s, and there was a lot of curiosity around that. Nowadays, no one's curious. Um, they just, and I also feel like saying, if people ask me things, I sometimes feel like saying, don't you have the internet? It kind of feels a bit personal. And so a lot of people would ask lots of questions about being a lesbian, and it felt really uncomfortable, I have to say. Um,
Mm.
I guess it came from a place of curiosity, but I think also there was an inequality. So, for instance, if I, saw a heterosexual couple, I might be curious about how that works, but I wouldn't ask the same questions as they felt they could ask me, if you get my
Yeah.
drift.
Oh, yeah. I do get you. I do understand that, because I've heard people ask questions that are quite personal, and to people who choose same-sex relationships. And you're right. They wouldn't ask generally of a heterosexual couple, oh, how does that work then?
Yeah.
Um, but on, playing devil's advocate, I have worked with some individuals who had no boundaries with questions. But even trying to put a nice spin on it, I don't think they were coming from a place of curiosity. They enjoyed making people uncomfortable. So they would ask these questions and probably not expecting an answer, but they thought they were funny. So
Yeah.
part of their weird humour. But all it ended up doing was making people feel, oh, well, I'm not going to answer. And they would often get up and leave because they didn't want to deal with it. Or they would get a little bit of verbal abuse back
Yeah.
as a result, because people sometimes, if they don't understand what you're asking or why, they can be quite defensive, and their levels of defense go from politeness to very unpolite language being used. I suppose because it goes back to, where we were talking before about when a child looks and asks a question, and you said it a lot depends on what the parent is saying. So down to the parent's knowledge and how they deflect it. How much information do you give? Do you say to the child, oh, that person has a genetic disorder, so we will go and have a look on mummy's iPad in the car in a moment and I'll explain it to you? Or do you give a full breakdown of what's wrong with that person in front of them, because you know what it is, and embarrass them because they don't like talking about it. So you can see you've got all sorts of, even when you're getting it right, you can still get it wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think why we were talking about that was that kind of natural curiosity that somehow kind of wanes as we get older. So one of the
Mm,
things I've been interested in, so one of the things that happened to me recently was that because my girlfriend is American, we've been taking a lot of interest in American politics. And so she was in a situation where she wanted the Democrat to win, which would be our left wing version, and then instead the right wing, which is Trump, that
mm,
the Republican got in. And so she was kind of very upset. And I said, well, what might be helpful is to look with curiosity at what, most of America voted this way. So let's be curious
mm,
about what would make someone vote for a very rich, misogynistic white guy as opposed to a kind of small mixed race black woman.
mm,
But alongside that, maybe it isn't about those things. Maybe it's about, one feels safe, one fuzz doesn't feel safe. And so it was interesting to kind of look with curiosity at that. And then the other thing that happened was that the day after his inauguration, which was just a few days ago, they had a church service. And I don't know if you saw that, but
I
so
did, yeah.
yeah, so I'll just, because it's a podcast, I'll kind of explain. So after the inauguration of the president, there's always a church service. So it's not something that gets a choice. It just happens. And then whoever the bishop is of that Washington church does the sermon. And so the woman did the sermon, the bishop did the sermon, and she talked about unity, which I think was already a preset subject to talk about
Mm,
unity. And at the end, she turned to the president and said, please have mercy on the LGBTQI people and the people, I mean, Mexicans. She was also talking about Mexicans. She didn't use that word. But the other thing she said, which I was then thought, I haven't heard that word before. So she talked about outrage industry. Now, I'd never heard this word before. So I'm like, I'm Googling that. So I Googled outrage industry. Now, this is links with curiosity, I feel, because the outrage industry is the people that make money from our outrage. So every time someone writes something on Facebook, and often it is about either immigration or queer stuff, that's the subjects that people get really riled up about right now. Um, every time that happens on Facebook, any social media, and people become outraged and they start writing comments, um, within that furore, somebody makes a lot of money.
yeah.
And this happened pre social media. So this happened before, like what sells headlines or, so generally, a headline that says, um, two people make friends or two different communities have made friends and they've built this thing, doesn't make, I mean, sometimes local papers tend to be like that. I did see a paper headline in Norwich that says, rat causes mayhem in city centre, which I just thought was hilarious. I just don't know whether the rat was alive or dead or what, but I thought it felt like just such a Norfolk headline that was the only bad thing that had happened, which is wonderful in a way, that's the only bad thing that might happen in a day. Um, so yeah, I guess uh, what I was thinking about was the outrage industry. So I then looked at some research about social media, and it was talking about how and we all know that the algorithms are a problem on social media, and it's not just about, like, you're led to believe it's about them, about it being so that the products that are put in front of you are relevant to you. So that's the way they
Mm,
sell it. But actually they're kind of taking your information and using it for nefarious purposes. And even that, I kind of felt like, oh, I don't know if I mind that. They can have it, I don't mind. But then when I actually read about how what they do is that they only show content that's extreme. So the content that's more extreme kind of gets pushed to the top. And this is that's something that's done by the people who own the social media. So also content that causes a lot of interest, which might be outrage, that also gets pushed to the top. But also there's the natural inclination of humans to be drawn towards something that, the same as the child points to something that's different,
Mm.
They haven't seen it before. Or, I mean, I don't know, if I was walking down a street, I wouldn't notice anybody probably because I'd be thinking about where I was going and what I was about to do. But if I saw some people arguing, I might look over and think, oh, is everything okay? And that's like our natural inclination is that if we hear some people shouting, we look over. Like if I'm sitting in the street and I hear a noise, I might think, oh, that's the bin men or that's the postman. But if I hear something that I think is not that and it seems loud, I might have a look through the curtain. I am a curtain twitcher, I admit it. I'll look through the curtain. I'll be like, is everything okay? What's going on? Has that dog escaped again or whatever? So, our natural inclination is towards the negative.
Mm.
That's that's my that's my problem in a way with these ex these extremes. So what happens then is averageness, which most people are average because that's the definition of average. If you think about a bell curve, most people are, roughly a certain height. A few people are really tall, a few people are really short. So everything is a kind of bell curve. Um, and social media pushes it towards the two extremes so that then you're forced to choose which extreme you want. So
Mm.
for instance, something like Brexit, I think there were quite a group of people who were kind of like, maybe most of us were a bit like, oh, I don't really know. Is it going to be a good idea? Would it be a good idea to leave or not? I mean, there's fors and against, but that wasn't
Yeah.
the thing that was being pushed forward. It was always the extremes of like, if we stay, it'll be terrible. If we leave, it'll be terrible. And so you were pushed. And the same way as like, people were vaccinated or not vaccinated, and there were these two extremes, and then there was
Mm.
the anti-vaxxers, so people were labeled. Where in fact, I think a lot of us were like, "Oh, I don't know. It seems like they've made this vaccine quite quickly. Does that seem like a good idea?" There was the bit of us that was curious and doubtful, but we weren't allowed that moment of, "Oh, I don't know," because we had to quickly make a choice, and then we were on either side. So I think that's the problem with the outrage industry is that we're pushed to extremes and then we choose, and then the other person is the enemy.
Yes.
And then that's the problem. So people are falling, I mean, even just silly things like, cyclists hating car drivers hating cyclists. A lot of people are both.
Yeah, I
It's
know. Where does that come from, though? That whole anti-cyclist movement.
I've been thinking about that. I think because I say obviously, it's not obvious. I do both. So I think there is a natural separation because the two are very different. They take up the same space, so they're on the same. It's not like pedestrians in cars where you have your separate places to be. With
Mm.
cars and cyclists, you're sharing the same space. So it's a bit like people in the park. You've got your runners, your dog walkers, your children, and they're all sharing the same space. So there's a kind of natural sense of like what's going on. But I think someone said to me, and I think I might believe this actually, that car drivers don't like cyclists because what they're seeing is someone who's paying very little money to get around. Um, and they're also often overtaking them in a traffic jam. And they've got the wind rushing through their hair, and there's a sort of sense of freedom, and it's a bit annoying because what you're doing is trying to sort of get somewhere and paying a lot of money for the privilege. The cyclists feel frightened of the drivers because they could kill them. The drivers, I think, are worried that they're going to kill them. I mean, I'm sure we've all had that where you're driving along and a cyclist comes in front of you and you think, I could have killed you,
Mm.
because you did something very quick. But then I've also heard drivers say things like, well, if he takes my wing mirror off, he's not insured. And I feel like saying, how many times has this actually happened to you? Where a cyclist has taken your wing mirror off and not paid you. I'm sure it has never happened, but it's that thought. And because we've paid a lot of insurance goes up every year, and cyclists are not paying any of that. They're not paying road tax. So there's a sense of inequality, perhaps.
Yeah.
One person
Injustice.
say,
It's been the injustice of it.
yeah,
And I can see what you're referring to. So where they feel there's a fear of missing out. You've got something I haven't got, even if they normally do it at the weekend. So that envy is being escalated by maybe some other body, and it's created that dysfunction between the two groups
I
because it
think,
feeds that
yeah.
jealousy. It's like if you look at it as a green monster. Oh well, you could be doing that. Well, I'm not doing it because I've got to work, or I've got to go and do the shopping, and that person's got the freedom that I haven't got.
Even though that person might be, delivering your pizza later in the day, and
Yeah,
all the
yeah,
checklists
I
now
know.
are
But that's
working.
that's called seeing that's asking them to have some logic about thinking about that person's life and maybe taking a little bit into consideration because it's a good example somebody gave recently on a similar thread is people who live in a van and how they're treated by different communities they go into. So if those individuals are bringing purchasing power, they're buying their groceries, they're using the local shops, they might be using the local pub, what is the issue with it? And some people say, well, they're jealous because you've escaped the rat race. You're not having to do the things that they've got to do. So, do people feel more enraged when you've escaped the cage and they're still stuck in it?
I think there's definitely that. I mean, I think that used to happen. So when I worked in the NHS, I was working a lot with people. So I worked in psychiatry, and so I worked with a lot of people who were very much at the bottom end of things. So they often hadn't. I wasn't in the well-being service, which is more, the general public. So it was people who'd often hadn't worked for many years and were on benefits and were very much like right at the bottom. They'd be in very rarely owned their own house. They'd be in social housing or council housing, sometimes private rented, but often not. Um, and even though you would see this person whose life was so ruined by their mental illness, and often that had come from trauma. I mean, these things, you don't get personality disorder from nowhere. You don't just kind of wake up one day and think, you know what, I'm fed up with working. I think I'm going to have a personality disorder and just go to bed, or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It comes from horrible traumas. But I think there's a bit of us, and we wouldn't admit it, where we were jealous because this person got to hang around watching television all day and not worry that someone else might be trying to harm themselves, and all the stress that came with working with self-harm and that. So there was that little bit of us that was just like um jealous, even though the person's life was kind of ruined by their mental illness. But I don't know if
Mm,
we would ever really accept that. I don't think we couldn't really go there somehow because we weren't.
yeah.
And I think there's a lot of that. Like to me, one of the problems that's happened. So, for instance, if you think about one of the things that's happened with the queer community is that we've become divided around trans women.
Mm,
Um, it's very unfortunate because we kind of need to stay together, really. I mean, we're not as together as we used to be. So we used to be very much a kind of separate group of people, and now everyone's kind of like a bit on the spectrum of queerness. So we're not like a separate group like we used to be, but still there is a sense in which queer people stick together and see ourselves as part of a community. And so to then have this group of people that um are maligned, or that there's no, it's not that they're maligned, there's this difference. So what happens is that there's some people who are just very accepting of trans women and see them as part of our community. Trans men sort of get a bit forgotten within all this, but the trans women
mm,
are the ones that everyone seems to worry about what toilet they're in and what sport
yeah.
they're playing and what have you. Whereas trans men, no one really kind of notices them. But um, so we have these kind of trans women that are kind of part of our community, and then there are some lesbians who are basically kind of saying, well, we don't really like the trans women because they shouldn't be part of our community because I guess because they have penises. I mean, I'm being very blunt here, but this is, I think often what isn't talked about within trans women is that it's the penis that people are worried about.
Mm,
That doesn't really ever get spoken of. But I think,
yeah.
so when it comes to things like toilets, that's what people are kind of worried about. And
Yeah.
Ricky Gervais made some quite blunt sort of jokes about this subject. Uh, so I guess what has happened is, I think then then what's happened is that we're not allowed to be kind of curious about this subject. We have to kind of choose that we're either for trans women or we're against them, and we're
Yeah.
supposed to choose. When in fact, I think most people have maybe some level of discomfort or some level in which we kind of think, well, actually, women who've been born, who were assigned women at birth and are doing sports, have always struggled to get paid properly and to get recognized. I mean, we're only just getting women's football now
Mm.
in a subject. So I think and it's weird because even like as I'm talking about this subject, I'm feeling anxious
Yes.
because I'm kind of thinking, wow, this could be recorded and listened to by people and they'll think that I think a certain way. But what I'm trying to say is that I feel like our natural curiosity about a subject has kind of been pushed down because we have to quickly make a choice. And I can remember saying to my girlfriend, I don't know which side I am on with trans women. And she said, you don't have to be on a side. There doesn't have to be a side. So I think that's what the problem is, and that's what's happening with social media, is it's stopping that curiosity where you just kind of sit there and kind of think, well, actually, you know, there could be some issues here that we do need to try and work out how. Because what I would want is that whenever anybody goes to the toilet, whether they're male, female, trans, whatever, that they feel safe in the toilet. Is that too
Yes.
much to ask that you can go for a pee and not feel frightened? That's what I want for people. But what's happened is we're supposed to have this debate about whether or not we agree who should go in what toilet, but that isn't what it is. What we want is for people to feel safe when they go to the toilet.
Yeah, I suppose, and that's something that the press has played around with people's fears for years around the lack of safety around public toilets. And I do wonder if that's had a knock-on effect on the damage that gets done in them, and the fact that local councils are wiping out so many public conveniences, so they're not available to be used because they don't want to get involved in it. They're saying
Yeah.
they don't have the money, but actually they can, some places charge and have it there as a facility, and it can be done. And you can have you can have no sex on the outside, so you can have a disabled toilet that's open to anyone, and you can have a toilet that is for whatever gender wants to go in and use it, as
Oh, I
long as
see.
it's got a door that locks and it's clean. I just want running water, and yeah, and to be able to lock the door is always of benefit. But it's just, and you would think it was something that we could have. You would know if you go to a town that there's a public toilet, but we're losing that, and I
Yeah.
do wonder if that's been a fallout. But
I
I'm
think
not quite sure where that's come from. Why is that happening? Why are we losing our standard facilities? Why have we got a system that's worse than Victorian times?
yeah, so I think what's happening is COVID has allowed toilets to shut and not reopen.
Mm.
Um, so that happened in so we have a local shopping place called Anglia Square. And if you look up Anglia Square, it's hilarious because it's become this kind of entity, where everyone talks about Anglia Square because they keep trying to knock it down and then not knocking it down and different things. So, but anyway, that's a side issue. But yeah, they shut the public toilets there, and now you have to go to Greg's. You don't have to buy anything, but you do have to ask them for the number. I think
Mm.
the number's always the same anyway. So, but it's just it's not as easy. But I think that's the problem. It's a problem for, any postmenopausal woman. No, I mean there's lots of people who need the toilet quite quickly for lots of reasons, but also
Yes.
anyone who doesn't have a stable home, will also needs a toilet that they don't have to buy anything for. So it is an important facility, but also
Mm.
councils are being squeezed so much. Um, but yeah, it's an
It,
interesting one, isn't it?
it is. It's difficult, isn't it? Because you look at the services and what was available. I suppose the only thing to do is if people are interested in why are these facilities going is where are their councils spending the money? Where's the toilet budget gone? And what was said at the council meeting when they decided to
Yeah.
close them?
I mean, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because people don't always realise that, do they? I never used to know where these type of conversations happened until I worked in healthcare governance. And everywhere has a meeting where somebody's meant to make a minuted decision around these things. It's not just done off the top of somebody, some good ideas club. So it is recorded, and if it's public, we've got access
Yeah, yeah.
to those minutes, and people can access that if they want to know what's been going on. I don't think many people do go and have a look. It's a little bit like how planning gets through,
Yeah.
and people don't protest in time.
No, I mean, there's something happening in our street where people want to make it one way, and it is quite it's weird because I never thought I would get interested in town planning, but maybe it's something about being over 50 where you suddenly get interested in town planning. And but so is it okay if we just have a slight segue, because I wanted to talk about um spirituality and curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because I don't want to kind of miss that out and get talking about toilets and one-way streets and
Shall we do a pause?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so if you stop for 5 seconds. Okay, so Helen, tell me about what makes you curious when it comes to spirituality.
Well, I'm particularly curious about the fact that people aren't curious. Because I was brought up as a Christian, so I was brought up in the Church of England, and that's partly it almost happened from birth. So because I was adopted through the Church of England, I then ended up being there's actually a letter that's saying we think Sarah, which was what my original name was, we think Sarah would suit a good Christian family. So I'm not quite sure how you work that out from looking at a baby as to what kind of whether a family should be Christian or not. But yeah, so the Church of England Children's Society adopted me. So I was kind of very curious about religion as a child. And I've even got my original communion book, which is so confirmation is when you're sort of in your early teens and you decide to kind of confirm yourself into the religion.
Hmm.
So that often most religions will have some kind of thing like this that happens in the early teens where you sort of make a decision to commit yourself. So I'm looking at the original book, and there's all these questions I've written, like, did Jesus really die? And was he born of a virgin? Did he really rise again? And is he really the Son of God? So all these questions, and there was so little space written for this particular question that I'd kind of gone down into the margins. So that was always there, that curiosity. And then later in my life, when I was at university, I became an evangelical Christian. So that was an even less curious place, where there was a lot of very definite ideas that were given out about how things should be. And it was all based on, well, if it says it in the Bible, then it's how it should be. And there's two problems with
Hmm.
that. One is that there are a lot, a group of men decided what should be in the Bible out of all the sacred texts there should be. So even what's in the Bible is kind of questionable. But even within the Bible, which may or may not be true, a lot of it's allegorical. You've also got the fact that it was originally written in another language and it's translated. And so there were lots of, to me, there's lots of problems with having a kind of only a Bible-based view of the world. Um, so then eventually I became a Unitarian, which they were, so they're a bit like Quakers, but they're basically the people who, at a time in Britain where you basically had to be Christian and you had to believe in Jesus being the Son of God, and you weren't allowed to have any other religion, the Unitarians kind of said, well, that's not okay. And so they could be put in prison at that time. They could be put in prison for not being that. So what happens now is Unitarians are quite kind of curious individuals who are kind of like basically saying nobody knows for sure. Like nobody really knows what happens after you die. I mean, there are people who say they've died and they've come back, but there's not very many people that's happened to. So we don't really know. We don't, to me, it seems like the world is a very mysterious and curious place. And we don't really understand why humans are here, what they're for, what anything's for. And I certainly, as time goes on, I feel less and less that humans are the only spiritual beings. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think we're the kind of the least spiritual beings because
Hmm.
we're so not in the moment.
Yeah.
As soon as I mean, one of the things about acceptance and commitment therapy is it's based on the idea that one of the problems we have as human beings is that although we're quite clever because we can plan things ahead of time. So when we had this meeting, we were able to plan that we would both be free at this time and we could sort of plan ahead. I would argue that probably animals aren't able to do that, although there is an element of planning, but not in the same way as with humans. Um, and we can also think back onto past mistakes and think, right, I'll learn from that. I won't do that again, probably, but at least we can try to learn from our past mistakes. But also alongside that, that gives us a lot of anxiety because we can think about how we regret what we did and then we
Hmm.
worry about the future. Um, but I think that little time traveling brain of ours then makes it so hard for us to be truly in the moment, which is what animals are able to do. And so in a lot of ways, animals are much more spiritual and much more connected. And I am much more earth-based than I used to be, which is why I've sometimes been to pagan moots locally. Um, so so that kind of, I guess for me, I think it's really important that we're curious about spirituality and we always come from a place of curiosity, and particularly when we're looking at other people's religions, because when you
Hmm.
look at a lot of the problem, I mean, people always blame religion for wars. I think even if we didn't have religion, I'm sure people would find a way of fighting. I don't think we can really blame religion for wars. I think you could blame oil for wars, or you could blame money for wars. I mean, I think probably humans would probably be would blame for wars, but often we're not curious about other religions. And I am really curious about other religions, even when I guess, even when I see things that I don't feel that comfortable with. So our local mosque has grown a lot bigger. I'm fine with that. I think that's great that people are, to me, it's great that anybody has any kind of spiritual life. To me, that feels really important. But it's got so big that there isn't room for the men and the women to worship on the same day, and they worship separately. So basically, the women aren't allowed to worship on a Friday, because the men have taken the women's space.
Oh.
Now, I feel really uncomfortable with that because to me, the solution to that would be to, you know, not, well, I don't know what the solution would be, but you wouldn't stop the women from worshipping. You would find some other solution. But at the same time, what I want to do is be curious about why. I don't know. I think if I'm honest, I don't feel curious about that. I feel that that's wrong.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, like the other thing that's happened is that our local park, um, a lot of the children's activities are run by the local evangelical church. And so there's part of me that's very uncomfortable with that because I know that they're also very transphobic and homophobic. Um, but at the same time, as the guy that runs the cafe said to me, the Socialist Worker Party aren't about to run the children's activities. So until that happens, we're going to have the evangelical church do it. And this is true. So at the end of the day, I can have my kind of values around equality. But what I also value is that the smiles on those children's faces when they're getting a week's worth of free face painting. And what child doesn't love face painting? I don't quite
Yeah.
get it myself. I kind of I just don't like the idea of someone's face being that near mine and then painting it. But children love it. So I think there's areas where I'm not curious, where I just kind of think that feels wrong. But at the same time, there's that kind of live and let live, I guess.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I'm not going to do anything about changing those things because they're what they are, and most people think it's fine. What I'm talking about is the park, is that most people enjoy the fact that there are free children's activities during the holidays.
Mm. And that's the community spirit being encouraged. So, excuse me. I wonder if any other groups consider doing it.
Yeah, what do you mean?
Excuse me. I wonder if any other groups in Norwich had considered running children's activities for free in the park.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there is a kind of local collective called the Common Lot, and they're very, very queer friendly and I would say left leaning, but they're basically a choir. But they do lots of activities in a local centre for children and things like that. I don't know if they would do anything in the park. They do. I mean, they're doing something on Mousehold Heath, which I mentioned earlier, a kind of play to do with Mousehold Heath. But I kind of think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I presume that one of the reasons why the church does those activities is that it hopes that maybe some of the children will then come to that church. I didn't get the sense that they were particularly trying to depart, trying to impart any of their beliefs during those activities. It felt like they were very much, this is what, we're just giving you activities. We're not sort of influencing, but maybe they hope that people will come to their thing. But I suppose in a way we're perhaps we don't like to admit it. Perhaps all of us are hoping that people will agree with us at the end of the day and join our way of thinking.
Yeah, I think it makes us feel comfortable if we can persuade people to think the same way we do. People are uncomfortable with debate, and you'll often find about if there is a debate where one person isn't willing to acknowledge that you're both thinking different things, sometimes it can devolve into being more of a defensive piece, and it loses that sense of friendliness. I've been on the receiving end of that when I've mentioned something that should have been a general discussion, but because the person didn't agree and were quite single-minded in their viewpoint, they their response was then to attack me verbally, and that I was basically talking a load of rubbish. So rather than saying, Sara, you're talking a load of rubbish, show me the evidence. I'm quite happy to discuss anything. I'm a university lecturer, love it. So if you've got a viewpoint, is that coming from your personal gnosis? And that's good, that's fine. So my personal perception is X. Or are you basing it on some evidence that you can give me to share, and we can both have a look at it and discuss it? Or is that viewpoint coming from your prejudice and your lack of open-mindedness?
Yeah,
And because sometimes we think we can get away with it, don't we? We think we can say that our opinion based on our prejudice, which is why you have people saying things in public which are unkind, because they're allowed to do it. Nobody challenges them and saying, is that coming from a brain that actually has knowledge about what you're talking about? Or are you being a bigot?
I think that's one of the problems that's happened in a way, with the internet, is that now everyone is a journalist. Um, that's not to say that journalists are perfect, but at least they would have been kind of trained to gather evidence and report in a certain way, whereas now anyone can kind of say anything.
Yeah.
Um, and it is interesting. I mean, like, I guess, say something about, I mean, I recently I was trying to make a spiritual point where I said, according to the laws of aerodynamics, bees should not be able to fly, but they fly anyway. So why don't we do things that people tell us we can't do? And then someone later on pointed out that the thing about the bees and aerodynamics is not true. It's just something people say down the pub. Um, but that the person who was, so I was having my sermon kind of assessed, if you like, and they said it was okay to say something that wasn't true in order to make a spiritual point. They believed, but at the same time, I felt a bit worried that I'd actually thought this thing was true about bees, um,
Mhm.
just because I thought it was cute and funny. But I hadn't ever actually looked it up to see whether it was true. And of course, the laws of aerodynamics must be wrong if because bees do fly. So therefore, um, it probably is quite unlikely that it's true about bees having not being able to fly according to the laws of aerodynamics. Um, yeah.
If it is, if they are flying, because some people believe that they don't fly, they have a different method of movement,
Oh, okay. What do
and
they?
that's why they're able to move.
How do they do it?
Well, there's I can't remember who it was, and this is not going to be helpful to anybody who hears this, but the hoverflies, if you watch them, so you'll notice them when they're in front of you. They're the ones that look like bees, but they sit there and then they suddenly disappear.
Oh,
So
okay.
the concept was that they're capable of interdimensional travel. So they don't fly because they aren't flying. They're just moving from one plane to
Oh,
another,
okay.
and that's why you never see them moving. But I think there has been some work done from a scientific point of view, looking at the scale of a bumblebee on because its wing dimensions are not sufficient to lift it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that would be where the piece came. So when they're doing the comparison of to lift X weight, um, you need to have a certain wing dimension to lift it up. A little bit like how a hang glider works. So a tiny one won't work unless you've got a tiny piece underneath it. So it's about that ratio.
Yeah.
Did you look and see where the bumblebee myth was debunked?
No, I mean, this was just some feedback that was given to me about whether or not it was the thing that I'd said was true because I hadn't really researched it. But
Because they may well have, that might just been their personal opinion.
yeah, I mean, I think they weren't particularly saying that they were just commenting on the fact that you might want to be careful about stuff that you've kind of, saying stuff you heard down the pub, which I wouldn't have heard it down the pub, but it was what it was that saying hearing it down the pub is like basically that, oh, apparently you can't, apparently aliens made the pyramids. And I mean, that's a whole other subject, isn't it? I mean, when I was in lockdown, I started down a bit of a I started off watching some alien stuff, which was very interesting. There's a particular guy, I can't remember his name, but for about the past 20 years, he's been saying that the American, particularly the American military, are basically seeing stuff the whole time, but
Mhm.
and they're not really reporting it. And that was quite interesting because it was then saying, um, what I found interesting, to me, it's quite interesting if someone's talking about aliens and that person who's talking about it is ex-military because they don't have much to gain from it. In fact, they could lose their job or they maybe they've signed
Mhm.
Official Secrets Act or whatever. So to me, that feels quite important that people are saying the whole time we're seeing stuff and we're not reporting on it because it gets covered up. But the problem, I guess, with that, so that's where the algorithms came in. So then, because I'd watched a few things, that were quite well researched, it then sent me down this kind of, I don't know
Yeah.
if rabbit hole's the right word, but it then felt like my computer and my phone and probably my television as well was basically saying, right, she's into this. And so I was then getting suggestions of stuff to watch that didn't feel well researched. That was, to me, to say that aliens made the pyramids it almost feels a bit racist. It's kind of like saying that we can't really believe Egyptians would build something this clever, so let's say that it was aliens.
Mm.
And yeah, and it doesn't feel like it's particularly well researched. It's just saying, we don't we think octopuses are aliens because they're not like other animals, and it doesn't feel like it's properly researched. So that's my other, I don't know if this is on the subject of curiosity, but it feels to me a bit problematic. It's good that we question things. It's good
Yes.
that we don't just say, "Oh, the Prime Minister has said there's no aliens, so therefore there's no aliens." I mean, we kind of like think, "Huh, I don't know if I just trust that as but at the same time, somebody who, someone else who's kind of running a blog or whatever and making money out of saying, stirring up interest in a particular subject. I don't know. I'm slightly worried. I mean, there is also then an industry, like we're going to kind of create this idea that there's, that the Queen's a lizard or something, or, to me that, you know what I mean? It's just like, it just feels a bit, that doesn't feel so curious as more kind of stirring up anxiety and kind of basically, yeah, it does. I don't feel that comfortable with that. I mean, I think it's great that we're curious that, I mean, the idea that there are no other planets with intelligent life, that's quite a strange idea. Like there has to be,
Mm.
billions of planets with human life. Whether those people have come over here and started walking amongst us, that's quite a leap. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I suppose the problem is that there are people with theories on different levels, um, walking around all of us, and we probably know people who have personal perceptions about what they think. People don't tend to talk about it so much, um, face to face, unless they're down the pub, and then we hear some interesting stories. Um, but what we see on the internet, sometimes some of the stories on the internet where people start sharing their experiences, sometimes it takes one person to say, this happened, and then people then say, oh
yeah.
yes, that happened to me as well. Yeah, there's some
That is,
certainly.
I mean, that is the thing that is great about the internet. So before, I might have been, I mean, for years, I never thought there was anyone else gay, And so in a way, the internet has really changed the way that we communicate with minorities. Yeah,
Mm,
you're right. Like the first person who says they were abducted, that would have been quite brave to kind of be the first person to say that.
yeah,
So what you're saying is, so now all those people who've had that same experience
yeah, they
can,
can. Because what I've noticed is there is a tendency in our past history that if somebody stood out and was different, they were often put away.
yeah, yeah,
Unless you were incredibly rich and people couldn't touch you, the average person had to be very careful about being different. And there's a lot of research to back that up, with what we've done to people, where they were incarcerated, even for the having a child out of wedlock was enough to put you into an institution
yeah,
because
yeah,
you were displaying behaviours that weren't acceptable to society. So yeah, there's quite a lot we've done to people. And I suppose that's part of the reason maybe why people can be quite cautious about sharing some of their thoughts face to face, because we've got a hangover effect still, because there's still people alive who would have known the people of that generation that were doing that.
yeah.
Um,
And we don't have that. Yeah, I mean that is one of the things about the internet is that otherness is kind of it's much more easier to kind of share stuff and connect up with other
mm,
people. But at the same time, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but there was recently we found a small bird in the street and we were trying to sort of work out what to do, and we could see that the parents were up on one of the roofs. And so we have a WhatsApp group. So I kind of said, "Oh, bird in the street," and then suddenly there were all these people in our street who were all kind of trying to work out what to do. And what was interesting was that I wanted to put it on our local NR3 page, which is our sort of postcode page, which is a bigger area. Obviously, there's quite a few thousand houses in the NR3 postcode, but I didn't want to because I knew it was a seagull, and I knew that as soon as I said seagull, then there would be this kind of they should go back to the coast, and and so there's something about, although we are incredibly connected, there's something about that, the fact that we can very quickly write a negative comment underneath and even do that anonymously. And you could
mm.
say, well, okay, that doesn't equate to being locked up in an institution. The danger's not quite the same. Yeah, so I mean, it is just an incredible world we live in, really, isn't it? It's just
It is.
it's
I
not
suppose
quite sure
what
how
it
it's
comes
going.
down to, if I was, analysing that, is that there's still fear about being honest. There's a fear to be, that we can't say what we really think because of how people judge. And sometimes we're pushed, and our perception about judging is happening on social media all the time, because people can write anonymous comments, and places that you thought were safe aren't necessarily safe to be open, because sometimes someone will step in to that group who's joined it for the wrong reasons,
Yeah.
and they will disabuse you of a fact. And I've saw that recently in a Facebook group where they were talking about coming together to send positive energy across to where the wildfires were in America, and joining together at a set time. And but somebody came through and made a comment that which really was unsupportive, and the person who ran the group said, if you don't agree with what we talk about on here, why are you in the group? Maybe this isn't the right group for you. And I believe there was a bit of back and forward conversation around, because this person, well, I've got a right to be in here. Yes, you do have a right to be in here, but we still have a few rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think
So,
there was something about that acceptance, but also alongside that boundaries. Um,
mm,
like I heard this recent thing which was called the tolerance. What was it called? The tolerance. Um, can't think what the second word was. It basically says that if you tolerate everything, then it becomes unsafe. So we like the idea that we're tolerant, but then so you might be tolerant in a group about prayer, say, or a group about sending positive feelings. So you're tolerant of all points of view. But then if someone comes in that makes it unsafe, then
mm,
you mustn't tolerate that, because then it makes it unsafe for everyone else.
yes,
Like, so,
yeah.
like if you're in a meditation group, you kind of go, oh, we welcome everyone. But then if someone comes in, like I tried to do, I took my dog into a meditation group and it was very noisy. And so I was banned from the, I was banned with my dog from the, which is right. I should have been told that I could only come without my dog.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think it is interesting when people have an open invite, anybody can come in, and how they work within the rules of that group, because are they told, well, this is how we tend to do things, or are you openly, whatever you do is okay? Because it isn't really, because we're human beings, and we know that we struggle with being completely open-minded, because we've got our little prejudices that get in the way. um it's quite I think it's quite difficult for people to be truly open, and yeah, human beings they quite frequently demonstrate that they struggle with the concept of true inclusiveness. There's
Yeah.
normally there's normally a little voice that goes, "What about X?"
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
Well, I think about the choir, the common lot. I mean, they're very inclusive of all, people transitioning and, whatever. um, and all people. But if somebody was voting UKIP, they probably wouldn't be welcome. I mean, I don't
yeah,
know. I'm saying that, and I don't know because I'm not in the group. But I
you
think
can ask them.
I could ask them.
Yeah.
But it's true, and I think like our church is very liberal, and we say all are welcome. But then if someone came along, um, I mean, somebody did come once who was kind of not our usual demographic. And I would say, I mean, he did leave, but I don't think he did feel that welcome. Um,
Mm,
so I mean, I feel awkward kind of saying it out loud, really. But the truth is, like you say, you can't, if you welcome everybody, then not everybody feels comfortable. So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
always a boundary,
I
within.
suppose that's part of this, because when we look back at what makes us feel safe, that's why we make some of our rules up, is because it makes us feel psychologically safe to say, well, there's a rule around, say, for example, putting a lock on the door. So some places would say you've got to lock the door, and other places go, well, I don't need to lock the door because I'm quite comfortable. I'm not worried about people just walking in. And so it's about managing our expectations as well. But we have these different pieces, don't we? Because it used to horrify my friends when I lived in a house. For the first 4 years, I never locked the door, and it was only when I had double glazing put in and I had a door with a proper lock that I locked the door when I went away for longer than a couple of days. But we had a very large black dog living there, and people being superstitious didn't tend to go in the garden where there was a big black dog. He was really friendly.
That's not superstition, that's just common sense, isn't it? I mean, it might
But
make it. I mean, it's interesting because I have this at church. There's these two dogs, and one of them is my Chihuahua, and the other one is this massive dog that looks like a sideboard, walking along. It's so big, and people are really wary of the big dog, but actually the Chihuahua's really got attitude, So there's an assumption made about. But I think it's
yeah,
also that thing of like, at the end of the day, if a Chihuahua got wrong with you, you could probably fight it off.
yeah, yeah. But it just, I just realised that we all have different things with our expectations, whereas I never expected anybody to walk in, so nobody ever did, and
You
I'm
find that
quite happy.
So you
Sorry,
saying that you think your expectation of people not walking in actually influenced whether or not people walked in?
I think sometimes it can. Although I was raised that in a village where people would knock on your door and walk in,
Yeah.
they'd call your name out, and on they would come. So the only way you could stop them from coming in was locking your door. um,
That'd be an
yeah.
argument for locking the door, wouldn't it?
So yeah, but I do think sometimes our expectations can flavour things, but that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for coming along today, Helen.
Thank you for
And
inviting me.
so we've talked about quite a lot of different aspects, and one of the things you mentioned was the church that you're with. Do you have any resources for people who would be interested to know more about the church that you're with?
Yeah, I mean the if you're sort of, from a national point of view, there's the UK Unitarians. So if you Google UK Unitarians, there's a website. Locally in Norwich, it's something called the Octagon Chapel. And
Hmm.
again, there's a website for the Octagon Chapel, which I manage actually. So it's probably in a complete mess with none of the links working and but yeah, no, so yeah, I mean, I'm not particularly evangelical about the Unitarians, but if people have had their interest piqued, then um, you're welcome to have a look. From the American Unitarians are called Unitarian Universalists, so they have
Okay.
and they have a national website as well.
And if people have listened and they've heard you mention your role as a cognitive behavioural therapist, how would they find you?
Oh, so I'm on the counselling directory um, as Helen Simpson.
Hmm.
I think there might be two Helen Simpsons. Um, but I'm the one that looks like a lesbian out of the two of us. And
Oh,
I'm the one in. Well, I mean, the other one doesn't at all look like. I mean, I got short hair, and also I'm Norwich based, so and I'm
okay.
happy to see people over Zoom. So
Yeah.
I only have a small number of clients because I also something I haven't mentioned here today is that I do performance, I do comedy and poetry and things like that. Um, which is another maybe a subject for something else. I am curious about what makes people laugh, but we didn't really talk about that. But
Yeah.
yeah, so people can find me on the counselling directory. I mostly only use Facebook, and I'm Helen Simpson on there, or I'm Helen of Norwich is my kind. Helen of Norwich is my kind of comedy name, so it's kind of like Julian of Norwich,
Yeah.
Helen of Troy, kind of mixed together. So I'm Helen of Norwich, guerrilla artist on Facebook. Because I used to do a lot of guerrilla art, but I don't now, and it's quite hard to change your name on Facebook. So that's where I am. If people want to find me, they're welcome to get in touch.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. Are you able to stop the record there?
Yeah, so oh yeah, it says
Oh,
ding. Sure, you sure you want to stop recording? Yes.